The Treasure of Robert Louis Stevenson. Part 2. Robert Louis Stevenson's second most famous book is Kidnapped, A Tale of Old Scotland. But the work that sent his name ringing around the world was a story born in midnight horror. His wife was awakened in the dark by the sounds of groans. Louis was turning restlessly from side to side in a bad dream. When Fanny shook him awake, he complained at being torn from his dream. It was a terrible dream of how the evil in a good man began to overpower him. Here was an idea for a story, Fanny quickly pointed out. And in 3 days Stevenson wrote the story. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. As soon as the book was published, it was praised by churchmen and in newspapers throughout the English-speaking world. Millions of copies were sold. For this tale of horror is also a great moral tale. There are a Jekyll and a Hyde in all of us. We have the power to choose between good and evil. But each time a man chooses evil, he finds it more difficult to choose good the next time. At last the evil Mr. Hyde comes out of hiding and overpowers the good Dr. Jekyll. While Stevenson the writer grew in power, Stevenson the man was sinking in health. Often he could not risk speaking, the blood in his lungs might rush from his lips in a hemorrhage. Yet nothing kept him from writing. Even when he had to lie in a darkened room, he created the verses of a child's garden, writing them blindly on large pieces of paper. He almost died many times. In 1887, shortly after his father died, Stevenson took a ship on what was to be for him a voyage of no return. His wife, his mother, and young Lloyd went with him. The first stop was in New York. Louis was so ill when he arrived that he had to spend the winter there at a special hospital for people with tuberculosis. Fanny traveled on to San Francisco and looked for a ship to carry the family to the warm South Pacific. Louis came later. He was so weak when he went aboard that the ship's captain expected him to die at sea. At last the anchor was pulled up, and the city and hills of San Francisco receded into the distance. Louis and his family turned their faces toward the Hawaiian Islands and all the other islands that he was to know and love in the years of wandering still before him. The sick man quickly began to feel better in the sea air. He loved the danger of a voyage because he loved courage. He believed that all the good in a man's soul depended upon his courage. Storms, hidden rocks, broken masts and unfriendly islanders were parts of his voyages. All this seemed good for him, and after a time he grew strong enough to travel alone. Once he was on a ship carrying a group of women who were going to the island of Molokai to take care of the lepers there. He went ashore with the women and visited the lepers. With his usual courtesy, he would not wear gloves to shake the lepers' hands. Stevenson was a gentleman, an adventurer and a man of letters. In his heart he was also deeply religious and a great moralist. And his morality was a morality of kindness. If your morals make you sad, he said, you may be sure they are wrong. His own morals gave light and warmth to all about him. He expressed them best in the prayers he wrote for use in the home that he built on the island of Samoa. Every night he led the prayers for his family and for the islanders who worked as his servants. Give us courage, and gaiety, and the quiet mind, prayed Stevenson. At last he had found these treasures in abundance. Here on a mountain in the South Seas he had built a great house. Inny shining, windy house, he called it. He filled it with beautiful furniture and silver from Scotland, books and pictures. Here he had beside him his lovely, kind wife and his gentle Scottish mother. Lloyd and Isabel worked with him and helped him in all that he did. The gentle, intelligent Polynesians who were his servants considered him their chieftain. Friends of the old days in Europe came to see him, drawn by the shining light of his personality. Health itself had come back to Stevenson, and he worked easily. He lived the life of an island king, with guests and gaiety, laughter and feasting and beautiful flowers. Suddenly, when he was only 44, a cerebral hemorrhage put out the light of his genius. Loving Samoans carried their chieftain to his last resting place on the steep slopes above his home. His own requiem is cut into the stone of his tomb overlooking the Pacific. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter, home from the hill.